Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Patrick Mackay, a name that echoes through the quiet lanes of Kent and the bustling streets of London during the mid-1970s. Our story begins not in the chaos of a city, but in the profound, heavy quiet of a village named Shorne, nestled in the heart of the English countryside. Imagine, if you will, the evening of March 21st, 1975. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and the first, tentative blossoms of spring. The Thames estuary lies just a few miles away, sending a soft, gray mist to cling to the ancient stone walls and the ivy-choked trees. In Shorne, time seems to move more slowly. The narrow lanes are silent, save for the occasional rustle of a bird in the hedgerows or the distant, muffled chime of a church bell. It is a place of peace, of tradition, and of deep-seated safety. But on this night, the silence is different. It is not the silence of rest, but the silence of a held breath, a moment where the natural world seems to recoil from the darkness beginning to unfurl within a small, semicircular cottage. In the center of this stillness lived Father Anthony Joseph Crean. He was a man of 64 years, a priest whose life had been dedicated to the service of others and the quiet contemplation of his faith. He served as the chaplain for the Carmelite nuns, a small, devoted group who lived nearby and relied on his gentle guidance. Father Crean's home, known as the Malthouse Cottage, was a unique building that felt more like a sanctuary than a mere residence. Inside, the rooms were filled with the soft, comforting smells of old beeswax, flickering candles, and the dry, sweet scent of aging paper. He was a man of immense patience, a soul who believed that even the most broken spirits could be mended with kindness and prayer. 19 months earlier, in 1973, he had opened his heart to a young man who seemed lost. He had offered guidance and a listening ear to a local youth named Patrick Mackay. Even after the young man repaid this kindness by breaking into the cottage and stealing a check for £30, Father Crean had remained steadfast in his compassion. He had asked the police for leniency, hoping that mercy would achieve what punishment could not. He saw a flicker of humanity where others saw only a growing, jagged darkness. But the darkness had returned to Shorne. On that Friday in late March, the peace of the Malthouse Cottage was shattered with a violence that felt almost otherworldly. Patrick Mackay, now 22 years old and fueled by an inner turbulence that few could fathom, made his way back to the village. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the garden path, where the primroses were just starting to peek through the soil. Inside the cottage, the floorboards creaked under the weight of an intruder who knew the layout of the rooms all too well. When Father Crean returned home from his duties, he found not the quiet sanctuary he expected, but a confrontation that would escalate with terrifying speed. We can only imagine the sounds of that struggle in the narrow hallway. The heavy thud of footsteps, the gasping breaths, the desperate scrape of shoes against the wood as the priest realized the man he had once forgiven had come back with malice in his heart. Father Crean managed to break free and ran toward the bathroom, perhaps thinking the lock on the door would offer a moment of safety. But in the shadows beneath the stairs, there lay a box, and within that box was an axe, a heavy, cold tool that was never meant for such a cruel purpose. The sound of the axe striking the bathroom door was a rhythmic, splintering intrusion into the night. It was a frenzied, relentless attack that tore through the thin wood until the barrier was gone. Once inside, the sanctuary of the bathroom became a place of unimaginable horror. Mackay, driven by a psychopathic impulse that would later leave seasoned investigators speechless, turned the tool upon the elderly priest. The brutality was not merely quick, it was observed. After the initial violence, Mackay did something that defied all reason and logic. He lifted the wounded priest and placed him into the bathtub, his clerical clothes still clinging to his frame. He turned on the taps. The sound of running water, usually so soothing and rhythmic, filled the small, tiled room, masking any sounds that might have escaped into the village air. As the tub began to fill, the water turned a deep, harrowing crimson, swirling around the ceramic basin. Mackay did not flee into the night. Instead, he sat on the edge of the bath, watching. He sat there for a long time, perhaps an entire hour, staring at his handiwork with a cold, detached fascination, watching the life ebb away in the rising tide of red, while the steam from the hot water filled the air with a heavy, metallic mist. Hours passed before the silence of the cottage was finally broken by the outside world. A nun from the nearby convent became concerned when the priest did not appear for his scheduled duties, a lapse in routine that was entirely unlike him. She walked through the darkening village, her footsteps soft and rhythmic on the damp pavement. When she arrived at the Malthouse cottage, the windows were dark, reflecting the moonlight like cold, blind eyes. She knocked, but there was no answer from within. The heavy wooden door, usually a threshold of welcome and warmth, felt strangely foreboding under her hand. When she finally entered and made her way through the stillness to the bathroom, the scene she encountered was one of profound tragedy. There, in the overflowing bath, lay the body of Father Crean. The water was still warm, but the light of the village's innocence had been extinguished forever. The discovery sent a shockwave through the quiet lanes of Shorn, a realization that the shadows they had ignored for so long had finally come to claim one of their most beloved residents. As the police sirens began to wail in the distance, cutting through the midnight air, the first chapter of this dark history was written in the blood on the altar of a peaceful home. The community was left to wonder how such a monstrous presence could have walked among them, unnoticed, until it was far too late. The darkness that eventually consumed Father Crean did not emerge from a vacuum. It was a slow, agonizing cultivation that began in the cramped, tension-filled rooms of a house in Dartford, Kent, during the 1950s. Imagine a young boy named Patrick, born on a crisp September day in 1952, living in a world defined by the heavy, sour smell of scotch and the looming shadow of his father, Harold. Harold was a man fractured by the horrors of the Second World War, an accountant who carried the weight of his trauma in the form of a violent, unpredictable alcoholism. The floorboards in that house didn't just creak. They seemed to groan in anticipation of a storm. Patrick watched from the corners of the room as his father's hands, often shaking from withdrawal or clenched in rage, struck his mother, Marion. The air in their home was thick, not with love, but with a paralyzing frequency of fear. For Patrick, power was not something shared through kindness. It was something seized through the strength of a fist and the sharpness of a tongue. He was a witness to the brutalization of his mother, a woman of Creole descent who had journeyed from Guyana only to find herself trapped in a cycle of domestic terror. This was the landscape of his youth, a blueprint of violence where the only language spoken fluently was the language of pain. When Patrick was only 10 years old, the atmospheric pressure of his childhood shifted in a way that would leave him psychologically untethered. It was 1962, and Harold Mackay was walking to work when his heart, weakened by years of heavy drinking, finally gave out. There is a haunting irony in the final words Harold supposedly whispered to his son before leaving that morning. "Remember to be good." To a boy who had only known his father as a source of terror, these words were a cryptic, impossible command. Patrick did not attend the funeral in Scotland. His mother, perhaps seeking to shield him or perhaps unable to face his reaction, kept him away. The result was a chilling detachment from reality. Patrick refused to believe his father was gone. He carried a small, crumpled photograph of Harold in his pocket, its edges softened by constant handling, and he told anyone who would listen that his father was still alive, just away for a while. In his mind, the ghost of the man who beat him remained the ultimate authority figure. As he moved into his teenage years, he began to mimic that authority, turning his own hands against his mother and his two younger sisters. The house in Gravesend, where they eventually moved, became a place of frequent police visits, sometimes as many as 4 times in a single week, as the boy's tantrums evolved into something far more predatory. By the time he reached his early teens, the warning signs were no longer mere whispers. They were screaming from the rooftops. Patrick's cruelty took on a grotesque, experimental quality. He found a dark solace in the suffering of those smaller and more vulnerable than himself. He would catch birds and, with a terrifyingly steady hand, tear the wings from their bodies, watching their frantic, useless struggles with a cold, unblinking curiosity. There is a particularly stomach-turning account of him placing the family's pet tortoise onto a bed of glowing coals, watching as the creature was roasted alive within its own shell. This was not the mischief of a troubled child. This was the emergence of a predatory psyche. In the schoolyard, his peers viewed him as a little terrorist, a boy who would strike from the shadows, blindsiding other children with a physical intensity that felt unnatural. He once attempted to strangle a younger boy, only stopped when he was physically pulled away by adults. Even his fascination with fire began to manifest as a weapon. He attempted to set fire to a Catholic church, an act of sacrilege that hinted at a deep-seated resentment toward the structures of morality and faith that would later bring him back into the orbit of Father Crean. The quiet, hallowed air of the sanctuary was, to Patrick, merely fuel for a fire he was already burning inside. The state's response to this burgeoning monster was a revolving door of institutions. Between the ages of 12 and 22, Patrick was removed from his home 18 separate times. He was a ghost in the system, drifting through specialist schools, remand centers, and psychiatric wards, leaving a trail of disturbing medical reports in his wake. In 1967, a teacher at one of his schools wrote a chillingly prophetic note, describing the 15-year-old boy as a potential murderer of women. But it was the evaluation by a psychiatrist named Dr. Leonard Carr that stands as the most haunting indictment of the system's failure. Dr. Carr looked into the eyes of this teenager and saw a void that could not be filled with therapy or medication. He diagnosed Patrick as a psychopath and issued a stark, terrifying warning. This boy would grow up to be a cold-blooded psychopathic killer. In October of 1968, Patrick was committed to Moss Side Hospital in Liverpool, a facility designed for the most dangerous of patients. The corridors there were made of hard, unyielding stone, and the air was thick with the scent of industrial cleaner and desperation. Yet, despite the warnings of the medical staff who lived with his volatility daily, a mental health tribunal ordered his release in 1972. They believed he was ready to rejoin society, ignoring the fact that Patrick himself had told doctors he felt he should never be let out. Released into the gray, bustling streets of London, the young man found himself entirely unequipped for a world that required empathy. He retreated into a bizarre, dangerous fantasy world of his own making. He became obsessed with the iconography of Nazi Germany, finding a twisted sense of belonging in a philosophy of absolute power and racial purity. He filled his small, cluttered flat with memorabilia, medals, photographs of dictators, and even a makeshift stormtrooper's uniform. He began calling himself Franklin Balvolt I, imagining himself as a world-conquering leader rather than a man who spent his days mugging elderly women for cigarette money. He would walk the streets with a rigid military gait, his tall, 6'2" frame casting a long shadow over the pavement. He was a predator looking for a hunt, his mind fixated on the weakness of others. He targeted the elderly, those who reminded him perhaps of the vulnerability he had seen in his own mother, or perhaps they were simply easy marks for his growing bloodlust. By 1974, the thin veneer of his control was dissolving. The peculiar feeling he would later describe, a surge of power that accompanied the act of violence, was becoming an addiction. He was no longer just a boy who tore the wings off birds. He was a man who was beginning to view the human beings around him as nothing more than prey, and the quiet, suburban streets of London were about to become his hunting grounds. The air in 1974 was heavy with the scent of coal smoke and the damp, metallic tang of the Thames. In the affluent district of Chelsea, the streets were lined with houses that whispered of old money and quiet security. Tall, narrow windows looked out onto the gray pavement, and the sound of distant traffic was often muffled by a thick, rolling fog. It was into this world of polished brass and velvet curtains that the young man moved, no longer just a drifter, but a predator who had found his rhythm. He walked with a heavy, purposeful gait, his eyes tracing the movements of the elderly women who moved like fragile ghosts between the shops and their front doors. To them, he was perhaps just a tall, slightly awkward stranger, but beneath his coat, he carried a restlessness that the city's gray walls could no longer contain. He began to haunt the edges of Chain Walk, a place where history lived in every brick and where the silence of the afternoon felt almost sacred. On the 14th of February, 1974, while the rest of the city was preoccupied with the small kindnesses of Valentine's Day, a cold shadow fell over the home of 84-year-old Isabella Griffiths. She was a woman of habit, living a life of quiet refinement surrounded by the mementos of many decades. The encounter began not with a crash, but with a deceptive softness. In some accounts, he had offered to help her with her heavy bags of groceries, his voice low and seemingly helpful as he walked her toward her door. In others, he simply forced his way through the threshold, breaking the safety chain with a sudden, violent surge of strength. Once inside the hallway, the atmosphere shifted instantly. The warmth of the home was punctured by a sharp, suffocating terror. He took her life with a chilling lack of hesitation, first by strangulation, and then with a kitchen knife that he drove deep into her chest. The act was not the end of his visit, however. Instead of fleeing into the winter air, he remained. He moved through the rooms of the dead woman's house as if he were the rightful tenant, his footsteps soft on the thick carpets. The details of those hours he spent in Isabella's home are among the most unsettling of his long, dark history. He did not immediately search for gold or cash. Instead, he sought a strange kind of domesticity. He turned on the radio, filling the house with the tinny, cheerful sounds of mid-afternoon broadcasts while the owner lay still in the kitchen. He tidied the space, washing dishes in the sink and stacking them with a neatness that defied his inner chaos. He even took the time to close her eyes and cover her body, a gesture that was less about mercy and more about making the environment more comfortable for himself. For a while, he contemplated ending his own life there, looking at the very knife he had used, but the impulse faded, replaced by a cold, hollow satisfaction. He eventually left, tossing the weapon into a tangle of bushes along the street. Isabella would lie undiscovered for 12 days, the silence of her home unbroken while the neighbors passed by, unaware that the air inside had grown heavy with the finality of her departure. A full year passed before the shadows returned to Chelsea with the same lethal intent. By March of 1975, the predator had grown bolder, his confidence fueled by the fact that the previous year's horror remained unsolved. He found himself in Lowndes Square, an area of even greater opulence, where the buildings stood like fortresses of white stone and wrought iron. There, he spotted 89-year-old Adele Price. She was a figure of grace, returning from her daily errands, unaware that she was being followed by a man who saw her only as a vessel for his rage. He watched her from across the square, his eyes fixed on the slow rhythm of her walk. When she reached her building, he moved quickly, slipping into the hallway before the heavy door could click shut. He overtook her on the stairs, his breathing shallow and controlled. He used a simple, practiced lie to gain the final entry, claiming he had injured his leg and needed only a glass of water. It was a request so mundane that it bypassed the natural defenses of a woman raised in a more polite era. Inside the flat, the the pattern repeated with a terrifying consistency. The glass of water was never finished. He strangled Adele Price with the same detached efficiency he had used a year prior. Once the struggle was over, the surreal stillness returned. He did not run. Instead, he found a comfortable armchair and sat down. The silence of the apartment was profound, broken only by the ticking of a clock or the distant hum of the city outside. He was so at peace in the presence of his crime that he actually fell asleep. He drifted into a deep, dreamless slumber in the very room where his victim lay. He might have stayed there for hours longer if not for the sharp, sudden sound of the intercom. It was Adele's granddaughter, calling from the street level. The sound startled him awake, pulling him back from the fog of sleep. He realized then that his time in the sanctuary of the shadows was running out. He slipped out of the flat and down the stairs, passing the granddaughter in the hallway without a word. A phantom in a dark coat vanishing into the afternoon light. He left behind a scene that would soon bring the police to the realization that a singular, monstrous presence was haunting the heart of London. The year was 1974, and within the heavy, soot-stained walls of the Metropolitan Police headquarters, the air was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and the rhythmic, metallic clatter of typewriters. It was a time of paper and ink, where every lead was a physical weight, a folder stacked upon a desk in a room lit by the flickering, yellow hum of fluorescent bulbs. Outside, the London rain slicked the cobblestones of Chelsea, reflecting the dim glow of street lamps that seemed to struggle against the persistent, rolling fog. In the quiet corners of the investigative offices, detectives were beginning to notice a pattern, not a loud or obvious one, but a subtle, shifting movement in the shadows of the city's most affluent boroughs. They called it a mugging spree, a series of opportunistic thefts targeting the elderly, yet there was a lingering coldness to these reports that transcended simple robbery. There was a sense that something far more volatile was moving through the streets, a presence that was learning, evolving, and growing bolder with every passing season of that gray and heavy year. The investigation into the death of 84-year-old Isabella Griffiths had become a haunting fixture in the minds of the local constabulary. When she was found in her Chelsea flat in February of 1974, the silence of the crime scene had been absolute. The detectives moved through her home with a practiced, reverent caution, their footsteps muffled by the thick, floral carpets. They noted the strange, almost ritualistic details, the way her eyes had been closed, as if she were merely resting, despite the savage violence that had ended her life. There were no forced entries, no shattered glass to signal a predator's arrival. Instead, there was only the chilling implication of a guest who had been invited in, or perhaps a shadow that had simply slipped through an unlocked door. The physical evidence was frustratingly thin. A few smudged prints, the absence of a few trinkets, and a description of a tall, dark-haired young man who had been seen loitering near the building. He was a phantom, a smudge of charcoal against the vibrant life of the city. And as the months turned into the long, biting winter of 1975, the file on Isabella Griffiths began to gather the fine, gray dust of a cold case. By the time March of 1975 arrived, the atmosphere in the precinct had shifted from frustration to a deep, gnawing unease. The death of Adele Price had reignited the invisible thread that the police had been trying to grasp for over a year. Again, it was Chelsea. Again, it was a woman of advanced years, living alone amidst the comforts of a life well lived. The detectives stood in the hallway of her apartment, the air smelling of her expensive perfume mixed with the metallic tang of blood. They looked at the glass of water left on the table, a small, mundane object that felt like a scream in the stillness of the room. Witnesses had been more forthcoming this time, describing a man who stood over 6 foot 2 inches tall, a figure of imposing height and a restless, agitated energy. He had been seen following her, a silent shadow pacing behind her as she carried her groceries through the afternoon light. The description began to circulate through the hands of every patrol officer. A young man, perhaps in his early 20s, with a gaze that seemed to look through people rather than at them. They didn't have a name yet, but they felt his presence in the shared details of the two scenes, a signature written in the way the bodies were posed, and the specific, chilling selection of items stolen from the sideboards. In the damp basements of the forensic labs, the invisible thread began to harden into a cord. Fingerprint experts, working with magnifying glasses and slow, methodical patience, compared the partial marks found at the Price residence with the fragments left behind a year earlier. The realization was slow burn, a creeping chill that settled into the bones of the lead investigators. They weren't just looking for a thief. They were looking for a man who felt an almost divine right to take whatever he desired, whether it was a silver fountain pen or a human life. The profile of the suspect was beginning to take shape. A loner, perhaps someone with a history of institutionalization, a man who harbored a deep-seated resentment toward the world that had tried to contain him. Rumors began to reach the Metropolitan Police from the neighboring county of Kent. Stories of a young man with a terrifying obsession with Nazi iconography and a volatile temper that could ignite over the smallest perceived slight. The investigators started to look toward the outskirts of London, toward the humble flats in Stockwell, where the man they sought was hiding in plain sight, surrounded by the spoils of his secret war against the vulnerable. As the investigation tightened, the sheer scale of the suspect's movements became apparent. He wasn't just a predator of the wealthy streets of Chelsea. He was a wanderer, a man who spent his days riding the trains, his eyes scanning the crowds for those he deemed weak. The police began to re-examine dozens of unsolved muggings and assaults, finding the same tall, imposing figure described in statement after statement. The invisible thread now stretched across the Thames, connecting the quiet villages of Kent to the bustling heart of the city. There was a sense of urgency now, a race against a clock that only the killer could hear ticking. Every time a detective closed their eyes, they saw the silver pens, the stolen jewelry, and the heavy, black boots that left no trace on the pavement. They knew he was still out there, walking through the fog, perhaps sitting in a crowded pub or standing on a railway platform, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, fingers brushing against the cold steel of a knife. The investigation was no longer a matter of if they would find him, but whether they would reach him before the next glass of water was poured, and the next shadow was cast against a lonely door. The rain in March 1975 was a persistent, chilling drizzle that seemed to seep into the very stone of London's ancient buildings. When the police finally arrived at the flat in Stockwell on the 23rd of the month, the air was heavy with the metallic tang of damp pavement and the low, rhythmic thrum of idling engines. Inside the hallways, the walls were thin, echoing the distant, muffled sounds of a city entirely unaware that one of its most shadow-haunted residents was about to be brought into the cold light of justice. Patrick Mackay sat in the dimness of his room, a figure whose presence seemed to absorb what little light remained. When the handcuffs finally clicked, a sharp, clinical sound that cut through the heavy silence, there was no immediate explosion of violence. Instead, there was a stillness that felt more unnerving than any physical struggle. As he was led toward the waiting patrol car, the black leather of the officers' jackets creaked in the biting cold, and the blue emergency lights painted the wet streets in rhythmic, artificial pulses of sapphire and deep shadow. The interrogation room was a small, claustrophobic box of beige and gray, tucked deep within the heart of the police station. It smelled of stale tobacco, harsh floor wax, and the faint, bitter scent of overbrewed tea that had gone cold in the pot. A single fluorescent light hummed overhead, a constant, low-frequency vibration that filled the long, heavy pauses between the detectives' questions. Detective Superintendent John Bland sat across from Mackay, the table between them a scarred expanse of dark wood that had witnessed 1,000 desperate denials over the decades. But Mackay did not deny. He sat with a strange, unnervingly erect posture, his large hands resting perfectly still on the table, though his fingers would occasionally twitch as if he were tracing an invisible, intricate pattern on the wood. The detectives watched his eyes, dark, distant, and flickering, with a light that suggested he was looking at something far beyond the confines of these four walls. The air in the room felt stagnant, as if the very oxygen was being weighed down by the gravity of the stories that were about to be unearthed. He began to speak in a voice that was unexpectedly calm, a low and melodic cadence that contrasted sharply with the jagged brutality of his words. He talked first of Isabella Griffiths in February 1974, describing the profound silence of her Chelsea home and the precise weight of the knife in his hand. He spoke of the 84-year-old woman, not with any flicker of remorse, but with a clinical, chilling detachment, as if he were merely recounting the dry pages of a book he had read in his youth. Then came the mention of Adele Price in March 1975, the 89-year-old who had offered him a simple glass of water, a final act of kindness met with a darkness she could never have anticipated. He described the way the afternoon light moved across the floor of her apartment, the soft sound of her breath, and the final, heavy silence that followed his actions. The detectives took notes in a feverish silence, the scratch of their fountain pens the only rhythm in the room, recording a litany of violence that seemed to stretch back through the years like a long, blood-stained shadow across the map of London. As the hours stretched into the deep, quiet hours of the night, the true nature of Mackay's internal world began to emerge. He did not see himself as a common thief or a man driven by simple desperation. He spoke of a higher, darker calling, referring to himself with a chilling reverence as a disciple, a follower of a shadow path that he believed was his inescapable birthright. Back in his flat, investigators had already discovered the physical icons of this obsession. Nazi memorabilia and photographs that spoke of a deep-seated fascination with absolute power and historical cruelty. In the sterile interview room, he leaned forward, the yellow light catching the sharp, hollow angles of his face, and spoke of his perceived destiny. He called himself the Disciple of Darkness, a title that felt heavy and archaic in the modern setting of the precinct. To him, the killings were not mere crimes. They were essential acts of a chosen individual, a manifestation of a dark will that he believed set him apart from the rest of humanity. He spoke of an animal experience, a surge of energy that arrived with the taking of a life, his eyes wide and fixed on a point somewhere over the detective's shoulder. The confessions did not stop at 3. Like a dam breaking under immense pressure, Mackay began to list others, names and places that the police had held in their unsolved files for many months. He spoke of a homeless man, nameless and forgotten, whom he claimed to have thrown from a bridge into the freezing, black waters of the River Thames in January 1974. He described the sudden splash and the way the ripples were quickly swallowed by the relentless current. He spoke of Heidi Emnilk, a young German girl on a train in 1973, describing the rhythmic clatter of the tracks and the sudden, violent rush of air as the carriage door was forced open. He mentioned Ivy Davies in Essex, the elderly shopkeeper, and Sarah Rodmell in Hackney. Each story was delivered with the same haunting sensory precision, the smell of the evening rain, the rough texture of a coat, the specific fading shade of a twilight sky. By the time he reached the 11th claim, the small room felt as though it were filled with the ghosts of the fallen. A heavy and invisible crowd gathered in the flickering, narrow space between the killer and the law. When the final tape recorder stopped spinning and the detectives finally stepped out into the hallway, the world outside the station seemed altered and fragile. The first light of morning was beginning to touch the distant rooftops of London, a pale, gray dawn that brought light but no warmth. Behind them, in the profound silence of the holding cell, the Disciple of Darkness remained, a young man of only 22 years who had seemingly carried the weight of a dozen deaths within his mind. The investigators moved like ghosts themselves, their faces etched with the deep exhaustion of having looked directly into a void for hours on end. The sheer scale of what Mackay had claimed was staggering. It was a map of the city and the surrounding counties marked by his every movement, a trail of violence that spanned 2 long, terrifying years. As the station began to wake up to the sounds of a new day, the distant noises of the city returning to life felt hollow. The interrogation was over, but the echoes of his low, rhythmic voice would remain in that beige room for a long time to come, a lasting reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a calm face and a quiet name. The air inside the Old Bailey in late November 1975 was thick with the scent of damp wool and cold mahogany. It was a month where the London fog seemed to seep through the very stones of the courthouse, bringing with it a chill that no radiator could fully dispel. Patrick Mackay sat in the dock, a tall, imposing figure framed by the dark, vertical bars of the enclosure. He wore a suit that seemed slightly too small for his frame, and his eyes, often described as restless and piercing, were fixed forward. The courtroom was a theater of shadows. Dust motes danced in the pale, filtered light that struggled through the high, arched windows, settling onto the stacks of legal parchment and the black robes of the barristers. There was a profound, heavy silence that preceded the proceedings, a silence that felt like the indrawn breath of history itself. The wooden benches, smoothed by a century of anxious waiting, creaked softly as the gallery shifted, their collective gaze fixed on the young man who had once called himself the disciple of darkness. In that room, the frantic violence of the previous months was distilled into a series of clinical, measured statements. But the tension remained, vibrating like a low, resonant frequency against the walls. When the judge, Mr. Justice Milmo, finally spoke, his voice was steady, carrying the weight of the state's ultimate authority. He looked at Mackay, not with anger, but with a chillingly calm assessment of the danger he represented. The verdict was recorded: manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility for the deaths of Isabella Griffiths, Adele Price, and Father Anthony Crean. The court had listened to the harrowing details of the attacks: the axe, the knife, the sheer, unbridled force of a man who admitted he found an animal pleasure in the act of killing. The judge's words were sharp, cutting through the stillness like a blade. He called Mackay a highly dangerous man, a menace to the public who required prolonged and indefinite detention. The sentence was life imprisonment, a term intended to ensure that the iron gates would not open for him until he was no longer a threat. As the sentence was passed, the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of a clock somewhere in the hall and the soft scratching of a journalist's pen. Mackay was led away, his footsteps echoing down the stone stairs toward a world of gray concrete and steel bars, leaving behind a courtroom that felt suddenly, hollowly empty. But as the prison doors locked behind him, a different kind of silence began to grow, the silence of the unclaimed. During his time on remand in Brixton Prison, Mackay had whispered of other names and other places. He had spoken of a total of 11 lives taken, a map of tragedy that stretched across London, Essex, and Kent. He described the terrifying moment Heidi Emnilk was thrown from a moving train, the brutal end of Ivy Davies in her cafe, and the unidentified homeless man cast into the cold, black waters of the River Thames. These were not just statistics. They were stories of people who had walked out of their doors one morning and never returned to the warmth of their homes. However, once the trial concluded, Mackay retracted these confessions, pulling the veil back over the mysteries he had briefly illuminated. To this day, the families of those 8 other victims live in the quiet, agonizing space of the unknown. They carry the weight of names like Mary Hines and Frank Goodman, names that hover on the edge of justice, but are never quite allowed to cross the threshold. These cases remain on file, gathering dust in manila folders, while the only man who truly knows the truth remains silent, his secrets locked away as securely as he is. Decades began to layer over one another like falling leaves. Outside the prison walls, the 1970s faded into the neon glow of the 80s, the digital dawn of the 90s, and the hyper-connected world of the 21st century. Cars changed shape, buildings rose and fell, and the people Mackay once knew grew old and passed away. But for the man inside, time took on a different texture. It was measured in the transition from category high-security cells to the slightly softer edges of open prison conditions. He eventually changed his name to David Groves, seeking perhaps to shed the skin of the monster he had been. But the past is a shadow that does not detach. Now, as one of the longest-serving prisoners in the United Kingdom, he has spent 50 years within the system. He has watched the world through television screens and high-fenced perimeters, a relic of a darker era. The parole board has met 12 times to consider his fate, reading through thousands of pages of psychiatric reports and victim impact statements. Each time, the consensus remains a cautious, heavy no. The memory of his violence is too vivid, the risk of his internal weather turning stormy once again too great for the gates to swing wide. Tonight, as the wind rustles the trees outside your window and the distant hum of the world fades into the background, we reflect on the lingering echoes of those 1975 crimes. The story of Patrick Mackay is not just a tale of horror, but a meditation on the permanence of loss and the slow, grinding machinery of justice. It reminds us of the fragility of the peace we often take for granted. The victims, both those named in the indictment and those whispered in the shadows, are part of the landscape now, their memories preserved in the quiet corners of the communities they once inhabited. The darkness that Mackay sought to serve has been contained, held back by the weight of half a century of stone and iron. As we reach the end of this journey into the shadows, the details of the trials and the confessions can begin to soften and blur. The heavy doors have closed, the lanterns have been dimmed, and the night has reclaimed its stillness. You are here in the safety of the present, where the ghosts of the past cannot reach. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.